أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. We're going to resume our seminar on Aristotle's De Anima. We are in book 2, and we finished about half of book 2 last time, so we should be I think about in about chapter 5. It's in book 2, the first few chapters, that it's actually in the first chapter of book 2 that Aristotle introduces the definition of the soul in more than one passage, and he essentially describes the soul as the first perfection, the first completion, the first actualization, or entelechia of an organic body having life in potentia, or having the potentiality for life. And so, of course, Aristotle regards, as we have said many times before, plants, animals, and human beings all to be alive. And so each of them, in some sense or another, has soul. However, what he is concerned with in the remainder of book 2 are what we may call the powers or the capacities, the quwa, the faculties of the soul. Thus, he spends the remainder of the second book of the De Anima, which we're going to focus on today, looking at the human senses. And he's more really now concerned with the human soul. He does, of course, mention plants and animals, but now obviously the focus will be, it's very clear that the focus is more on human beings. So the discussion in the remainder of book 2 is on perception, or we may say on sense and sensibilia. In other words, on the 5 senses through which human beings perceive the universe, and then the perceived objects, the perception itself. And what this will lead into in book 3, which is really where I'd like to focus. So once we finish this, I think there's really a great deal of things, a great number of things which we need to think about when we get into book 3, because the whole question is, of course, Aristotle has defined or described the soul as an actuality or a perfection of the body. And of course, this is intimately linked, as I have said many times before in these meetings, in these seminars, to the hylomorphic understanding of the soul. So the soul is the form of the body, and the body is the matter. Again, these are the various causes, the 4 causes, 2 of the 4 causes, the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause, which we find in Aristotle. But again, as I also have said many times before, when we talk about the 4 causes, it's maybe better now, given the way that most people understand the word cause, to speak of 4 kinds of, or methods or modes of explanation, because most people today, when they hear the word cause, what they really think of is what in Aristotle is the efficient cause. And so that's because modern science is only concerned with efficient causality. Of course, they have some notion of matter, so I suppose they have material cause, but they're not really interested in formal or final causes. Even though the fact is that the efficient cause and the final cause are reciprocally necessitated, as is argued at length by Ibn Sīnā in the Shīʿah. And this is something which has not really been given sufficient attention, and was not really studied in any great depth in Western writing on Islamic philosophy before the 1994 dissertation of Robert Wisnowski, who was a professor at McGill University and who went to Princeton University. He was a few years ahead of me. I had a brief encounter with him there. And I have a copy of his dissertation, which he never published, called Final Causality in Avicenna. And out of that book, out of that thesis, and of course, other investigations and extended readings and contemplation by Professor Wisnowski on Avicenna, he wrote this extremely important book called Avicenna in Context. I've had occasion to mention this before, and I can't mention it enough. I wish this was more widely read, but obviously these are difficult books, and Aristotle and Avicenna and Islamic philosophy are not exactly TikTok material, shall we say. So before we jump into the text today, I think that it would be worthwhile to consider any comments and questions, because we've been meeting sort of haphazardly over these last several weeks, and different people have been catching up and so forth. Not everyone's been able to attend, but the recordings have been made available on Telegram. So I'm just going to stop here before we jump in today and open it up for any kinds of questions and comments, and then we'll go from there. And I have plenty of time today, so it shouldn't be a problem.
Yes, I'll go ahead and jump right in.
Okay, Saiyad, go ahead.
So the first question is related to the introduction in Christopher Shield's translation of Aristotle, where he does not say the word contradiction, but he mentions that there are various problems one needs to deal with when it comes to the hylomorphic understanding of the soul. Because in many ways, the soul seems to be an exception to a more rigid hylomorphism. So if we go to page
Roman numeral
23 at the beginning of it.
XXIII.
Yeah, so he says that
it follows in these cases.
Yeah, and going 4 lines down. In any instance of generation, the matter comes to be informed only contingently by a given form.
Formed,
yes, en. Because while essential to the generated compound, the form is accidental to the underlying matter. It turns out, however, that this generalization does not obtain in the case of souls and bodies. So, while for example, if you melt a bronze statue and it becomes, a puddle of bronze, it can, in potential, become something else afterwards. But that is not the case.
Recast it.
Yeah, that is not the case of the soul and the body, because he chooses to define the body as something which has, the function of performing all of these different, numu, growth, nutrition, and whatnot. So the question really is that, I mean, is this an exception to the rule, as Christopher Shields alludes to, or is there another way to go about this? Because obviously one way Aristotle can come around to it, and Shields mentions this as well, is that he can redefine the body as not being defined by its functions, but then that would contradict his own principle of functional determination, which, things are defined by the function that they carry out.
Yeah, I think that this is not the only problem, or the only, how does he term it, a problem about soul-body hylomorphism. So this is not the only problem or difficulty, or maybe even contradiction in the Dhyānama. There are lots of problems here, because another one has to do with the concept of the immortality of the soul, which, in other words, the soul surviving the body, which he doesn't really go into, and sort of leaves, and that we'll get into that more later. But I think that Shields is right here. I think there is a serious issue.
And then the second issue that he brings up in the doctrine of hylomorphism and the soul is the concept of reason as well, because Aristotle alludes to the fact that reason is something which can live beyond the body.
Yeah, so this is what he's calling reason is what other some translators call it, especially very more recent modern 20s, modern writers call it mind.
No.
And then others will say intellect. But what they mean is aql and of course in Arabic also aql is used in different senses on the context. And so that's what Aristotle leaves undiscussed. However, and it's very hard to say. I think you had also asked me about the biography of Aristotle. I'll mention that later, but in this context, that work, which was in Italian. Actually, let me go get it. Let's just hold on for a second.
If we take that paragraph, it means that soul cannot exist without matter.
Yeah, that's his general understanding that
With this.
form and matter together.
Okay, so literally just hold that thought. Let's not lose the thread.
Yeah.
So you had earlier asked, you'd called me on the phone about a biography, and I've mentioned this in other videos, but this is an important biography of Aristotle. It's called Aristotle, His Life and School by Carlo Natali. So this was written in Italian. This is a Princeton University press. This is a very scholarly work, and it's a historical work. It's not really about philosophy. So it's about whatever we know about his life, and a lot is said about him. How true is this account of him having, been the teacher of Aristotle, for example, and how much time did he spend there, or how much time did he spend with Plato, blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. But it also deals with the Aristotelian corpus. And that brings me back to your question. So if you compare the De Anima as we have it today, let's say in Shields and the Greek editions, right? And you compare that with what Averroes has in his middle commentary on the De Anima, sometimes it doesn't match up exactly. And there is what we call in Arabic taqdim and ta'khir, meaning that some things are not in the same order as we have, let's say, in the English versions that we're using. So some things might come before or after. And it's true, there is a certain amount of elaboration by Averroes, but it more or less follows the same order. So this brings me to the question of what Shields called reason, or what we really should refer to maybe more accurately as intellect or aql, and I think the Greek would be nous, is that if you refer to if we go back, so Aristotle also, this is what happens in these writings. Are these writings really in their final polished form? I don't know that we can answer that question, because he sometimes presents things before, returns to them later, and you just get the impression that maybe this isn't necessarily a fully polished work. Or you could say that, well, Aristotle is writing this in a particular style. He's doing it on purpose. He doesn't want anybody and everybody, all and sundry, so to speak, to be able to access these very high and profound and recondite doctrines. I really don't know. But if you refer back to book 1, and in book 1, chapter 4, he sort of alludes to this idea on of the immortality, in some sense, of the soul, or the intellect. Really, the immortality of the intellect is alluded to or suggested. Now that's in, as I just said, De Anima, book 1, chapter 4. It's around 408b if we use the standard referencing numbers. And so if you refer to that, he says, someone might more fairly raise a difficulty concerning how the soul is in motion by focusing on these sorts of considerations. We say that the soul is pained and pleased, is confident and afraid, and further that it is angry, and also that it perceives and thinks. But all of these seem to be motions, in other words, changes. On this basis, one might suppose that the soul is in motion. But this is not necessary, for let it be the case that being pained or pleased or reasoning are motions. So if there's reasoning, and that each of these counts as being moved, and that the movement is affected by the soul. So it's a long passage. It goes on. And if you consider this all the way to the end, you get this idea about the immortality of the intellect, or what he calls reason here. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to read this whole thing. It goes on for a couple of pages from 408b basically to the end of the chapter. So that would be 408b. That's about yeah, line 1, from line 1 or so all the way to 409b, 16, 17, 18, line 20. So he implies that there is something that survives, but again, then that means that the soul is more than just a form.
And it begs the question that in this doctrine of matter and form, this hylomorphic doctrine, how do you really have something which develops, which is outside of matter and form, outside of the compound? And now, does that mean he would consider that the intellect, the nous, is form without matter, which probably seems to be the case?
Well, it's a pure, I would say it's an aql, it's an
pure
aql,
actuality.
it's an aql mujarrad.
Yeah.
It's capable of it's, I mean, I suppose you could say that once a human being dies, they can become an aql mujarrad, a pure intellect, because the angels would be pure intellects, right? They don't really need a body. So there's a lot that he doesn't really spell out clearly. And if you read Ibn Sīnā is a lot clearer. And I think that people who read Aristotle puzzled over these things for a very long time. And if you look at the commentary literature, which is in Greek, which I cannot, but a lot of which has been translated. So there's I mentioned this before, there's a Zoroastrian British scholar named Richard Sorabji who has been in charge of this very long project of editing these ancient commentaries and translating them in different, not editing, sorry, translating them.
Sorab with a V?
Sorabji. So it's, Sorab is actually Sohrab, right? Sohrab. And I'm told that Sohr is maybe a early and more ancient form of Persian of the word Surh. So Sohrab, Surh-ab would be red water. Wallahu a'lam. Anyway, the point is that he's had these he's been in charge of this project for a very long time, and a lot of these commentaries, I think 100 volumes have been published of all sorts of people. Syrianus, Ammonius Saccas, John Philoponus, who was a Christian. And the interesting thing is that Dr. Wisnowski was, I think he was some kind of either a graduate assistant or maybe as a I don't know, I think it was postdoc, but he was at some point, he was some kind of assistant. He mentions in the opening, I think, introduction or preface or chapter to Avicenna in Context, that he worked for Sorabji for a while. So the point is, he read a lot of these commentaries, and the key term in the definition of the soul, entelechia, is a word that Aristotle invented, and so there was a lot of debate over what it means. And so the commentators who came after understood the word in many different ways. So entelechia is also related to energia, a kind of energy or a power, but it also is related to other Greek words that have the sense of completion or end. I think it's teleios and telos. I don't have my copy of Wisnowski in front of me. I left it in the car the other day, and the car is not here. So I can show it to you another time. But those terms are mentioned And that's how we get in Avicenna this, where he starts glossing in his own sort of reworking of these Aristotelian materials. He uses words like tam, the verb tamma, and tamam, when what you have in Greek would be entelechia. And so he's seeing things through the lens of these commentators. Especially there was a guy, there's Ammonius Saccas, I think, and Syrianus, who then understand this entelechia, this actuality, to also have the sense of completion and also finality. And so that's why in Avicenna you have this idea of final cause and a kind of necessary, a reciprocal necessity as between efficient and final cause when talking about the soul, but also when talking later about Allah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is both the efficient cause and final cause of the universe. So there's a lot of stuff that has been sort of left hanging in the air. And it seems it's only in Islamic philosophy that later these things are investigated further and maybe refined. And that's why I think it's really interesting to read this book and then read it in the light of a Muslim thinker like Averroes, whom, by the way, Wazowski doesn't deal with. He's interested in Avicenna, and that's his specialty. But it's interesting to read Muslim writers, Muslim philosophers like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sīnā together and see how they really reworked this material. And I think that that may be part of the reason that, maybe with the exception of Aquinas, people read Aristotle in very weird ways. Aquinas is still sort of within this framework, but Averroes, Avicenna, and so forth. Although whatever he's reading in Muslim philosophy is through Latin, and what Averroes and Ibn Sīnā were reading, of course, was reflected through Arabic. So there is, I don't want to say distortions, but there are shifts, and very interesting shifts that take place. But modern people, they have this whole other thing after Descartes called philosophy of mind, which is completely different. In this regard, I came across a very inexpensive and nice little book, which I picked up in one of those used bookstores, called Body, Mind, and Death, a reader edited and with an introduction by Anthony Flew. Anthony Flew was a prominent atheist. But before he died, he decided that he was wrong.
Oh, really?
I don't know if and he became a theist. I don't know, if he professed any particular religion after that or not. So this is a nice little collection by Anthony Flew. And, everybody's there. You've got these early Greek doctors like Hippocrates, then he goes to Plato, Aristotle, a lot of excerpts from the De Anima, Lucretius, Aquinas, Descartes, Baruch Spinoza. I mean, so these kind of books are useful, especially if you can find it in a paperback. This is just a few dollars, and you have a lot of these excerpts from people, so you can get a good overview. And then if you want, you can go and follow up on those books. So Aristotle mentions this.
If before we begin, one quick question, but it's related to the topic of analysis today.
Okay.
So there is a discussion about what is the more appropriate word for the quwwa of the soul, whether we should go with capacity or faculty.
Right.
And so that's one.
Again, you're going on in introduction by
Shīʿah. I am going to page 28.
Roman numeral 28.
Roman numeral 28. XXVII. It should be 28. Yeah, so it starts off. It is sometimes contended misleadingly that the Aristotelian soul is a set of capacities. This is misleading first because the Aristotelian soul is not a set. And more importantly, secondly, because it is not an aggregative entity at all. Does this just mean that the soul is basit wa laysa murakkaban? Or what would that mean, that the soul is not a set and it is not an aggregate?
Yeah, so he's referring to these passages. It seems that your question is going in the direction of hylomorphism again, because it's really, Aristotle is really only concerned with looking at those capacities, but he's not really further analyzing that hylomorphism, because then if you say the soul is an aggregate
Mhm.
of all of those, then you're again introducing more and more parts, and he doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
He's even when he says that the soul is the completion or perfection, he's saying that you don't really conceive of them as separately, just like you don't conceive of the impression made in a wax, for example, as different. The example that he gave when we discussed in the previous meeting. So he's saying it doesn't make sense to speak of it as two separate things, but the soul by its very nature, by its very essence, has these capacities.
So the Arabic term basit would not be appropriate in this context.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But it is one thing. It is one thing. So it would seem that he's analyzing, because the one thing that we're talking about is we have a living thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And every human being can distinguish a living thing from a dead thing.
No.
And it's characterized by motion and certain capacities, because look, like a cat or a dog has these various capacities. And then a human being, we have our own self-awareness that we have these various capacities of our five senses and so forth. So he's really trying to philosophize here on this principle of life. Right? So this principle of life is intimately bound up with the body, but again, it's not separate from.
No.
The only thing he sort of leaves hanging is the intellect. And you've got all this discussion about all these different capacities, which is coming up. I don't really know how deeply profound it is. Some of the stuff is like, yeah, okay, we see in the object of perception of the eye is to perceive color, for example, and then he discusses what smell is, and smell and sort of hearing and smell and touch and all, and he goes sort of through the list. And then he leaves the rest for the next book, this whole question of intellect, and really what it means to know a thing. And again, those are issues which I think are only really properly explained by Muslim philosophers later, such as the idea of the unification of the knower and the known and things like this in Mullā Ṣadrā and so forth. So
Thank you.
yeah, I don't know that there's any real deep, profound answer there, but this is a very important book, nevertheless, despite all these ambiguities, and it's extremely influential. And so anyway, so to turn to book 2, we're somewhere in book 5, but again, he basically defines at the very beginning of book 2 in chapter 1 what the soul is. So just to quickly go over that, in book 2, chapter 1, in 412a20, he identifies the soul as a substance. And I quote from Shields, line 20, this is page 22. Soul is a substance as the form of a natural body, which has life in potentiality. And again, last time, you can go back and listen to the recording, we read a lot of passages, long passages from these chapters from book 2. And then we read the same passages or the same parts in Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd is usually, I think, much clearer. So then further down, line 25, 26, 27, 28. Hence, that's 412a28. Hence, the soul is the first actuality of a natural body which has life in potentiality. So then he goes further on the next page, which is page 23, it's 412b, line 1. This sort of body would be one which is organic. By organic is meant having organs. And even the parts of plants are organs, although altogether simple ones. For example, the leaf is a shelter of the outer covering, and the outer covering of the fruit, and the roots are analogous to the mouth, since both draw in nourishment. Hence, if it is necessary to say something which is common to every soul, it would be that the soul is the first actuality of an organic natural body. So the ancients understood that there were organs. And so in modern medical science, we speak of an organ such as the heart, or the lungs, or the liver, or the kidneys, the spleen, the gallbladder, and so forth. But then the ancients would also have spoken of the eye as an organ, the ear, the nose. These are all organs. So the tongue. And this is where, just to reiterate again, I was talking about how he's saying that the soul and the body are the same. He says, for this reason, it is also unnecessary to inquire whether the soul and body are one. He's just completely dismissing the question, right? Just as it is unnecessary to ask this concerning the wax and the shape, nor generally concerning the matter of each thing and that of which it is the matter. For while one and being are spoken of in several ways, what is properly so spoken of is the actuality. So when it says that one and being are spoken of in several ways, he means al-wahda as well as al-wujud. They have many different meanings, and what is properly being spoken of here in this context is actuality. So the soul is also an actuality, and actuality itself is spoken of in different ways. So it would seem that if by actuality we mean entelechia, then we can speak of soul as both a completion as well as a kind of end result, a perfection, a kamal, or an istikmal, or something of that kind in Arabic. So now if we turn to, I honestly don't remember whether we left off, whether we did 5 and left off at 6 or what, but we'll just pick it up from 5. So after that definition then of the soul, he gives the definitions a couple of times. We have now to look sort of at the capacities of the soul, and he talks about how in the human being, for example, we don't really have 3 souls, a plant soul, animal soul, and a human soul, but we have the capacities of each. So there is a ascending scale. You have the soul of plants, the principle of life in the animal or the vegetable, in the vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, then in the human kingdom, it's the rational soul. And so the rational soul, and nafs an-natiqa, the human soul, if you prefer, subsumes under it the capacities that an animal would have as well as the plants, because obviously human beings have nutrition and growth and reproduction and locomotion and imagination and all of these things. So now it's a question then of looking at what these capacities mean, and he has looked at some of this before in chapters 3 and 4, looking in depth into, for example, what the nutritive faculty is and so forth. And finally, in chapter 5, of book 2, at 416b32, Shield's translation, page 32. With these things determined, let us discuss what is common to the whole of perception. So now he turns to the discussion of perception and what is common to all of perception. Now, again, it is very instructive, and although a bit cumbersome, but it's very instructive to read these books together. To read the Ibn Rushd paraphrase.
Page 60 on Ibn Rushd.
It's on page 60. So here, though, it says, with these things determined. But in the Arabic, it says, وَإِذْ قَدْ لَخَصْنَا هَذِهِ الْقُوَّةِ. And by the quwwah, he means the nutritive faculty, which is what Alfred Ivri, it's Ivri, Ivri, that's what it means. Alfred Ivri has translated as having summarized the nutritive faculty, whereas here in Arabic it says, وَإِذْ قَدْ لَخَصْنَا هذه القوة فقد ينبغي أن نقول في الحس العام فنقول إن الحس يظهر من أمره أنه إنما يقبل المحسوس من جهة أنه يتحرك عنه وينفعل. So this idea of التحرك الانفعال. With these things determined, let us discuss what is common to the whole of perception. Perception arises in both being moved and being affected. Now, when you see that in English, unless you know some logic and you know what the 9 accidents are, so these are usually accidents. They'll be number 9 and 10. أن يفعل and أن ينفعل. And he doesn't say yaf'al, but yataharak means like if you actually move, right? If something moves. So it's a fi'l. Having summarized the nutritive faculty, we ought to speak about perception in general. Evidently, a sense is that which receives a perceptible object in that it is moved and affected by it, for it is thought to be altered and affected by perceptible objects. أنه يستحيل عن المحسوسات وينفعل عنها وبعض الناس etc. etc. So then what is the nature of perception? So the question may be asked, of the 5 senses, do they sense unless there's some sort of external stimulus? No, they don't. If there's nothing to see, you don't see. If there's nothing to hear, you don't hear. If you're sitting in silence, right? Why is that?
Would it
This is the question he raises here.
would it be the doctrine of form reception, or the thesis of form reception, I guess is more appropriate.
Well, here he's really concerned with talking about potentiality and actuality.
Oh, okay.
So he says there is a puzzle as to why there is no perception of the senses in themselves, and why they do not produce perception without external objects, even though present in them are fire, earth, and the other elements of which there is perception, either in themselves or in respect of their coincidental properties. So this was the ancient understanding of things. Ibn Rushd says that he phrases that as follows. وقبل ذلك فهنا شك في أمر الحس يجب أن يقال فيه وهو لماذا لم تكن الحواس. That's not لماذا. Yeah, he wrote لماذا. Some of the editing here is a bit funny. Like the word thalatha, he doesn't put an alif. That's fine. That's an ancient spelling, but this should just be لماذا, not لماذا. لماذا لم تكن الحواس تحس ذواتها دون أن تحضرها المحسوسات من خارج، فإن موادها وموضوعاتها هي من جنس المحسوسات. Now here he doesn't mention these elements, notice. He doesn't mention fire and so forth as we have in shields. هي من جنس المحسوسات. مثال ذلك أن الأبصار الغالبة على آلتها الماء وعلى آلة اللمس الأرض. Oh, sorry, he does bring them in. الأرض وعلى آلة الشم النار، وهذه الأشياء التي يدركها الحس بذاتها أو يدرك الأعراض اللاحقة لها. So the wording is always somewhat different. It doesn't exactly match up, but it usually comes to the same. So the point is, he says the answer is والجواب. This is Ibn Rushd. في ذلك أن الحس ليس هو موجودا فينا بالفعل لكن بالقوة. And again, the spelling of lakin here is
Nice.
lam alif. In manuscripts, you find that, but usually this is just a footnote, but usually when you do a critical edition, you bring the orthography up to the modern, up to date, with the modern convention. So he's basically saying that it is clear then, this is Shields, that the perceptual faculty is not actual, but only in potentiality. For this reason, it does not perceive just as what is combustible does not burn by itself without something capable of burning it. Okay, so then, again, it's just an elaboration of actuality and potentiality, and you will see this throughout. So I want to pose a question, which maybe you think about and we discuss at the end. Why is he so concerned with actuality and potentiality in analyzing these senses? So now he says that, well, if we're talking about perception in the most general way, then we have to understand then that we can speak of perceiving in two ways. This is line 10 on page 10 and 11 on page 32 of the Shields translation. So the reason it's spoken of, perception may be spoken of in two ways, and he used the example of hearing. He says, for we speak of that which potentially hears or sees as hearing and seeing, even if it should happen to be sleeping. So if you have a human being, in this case, this would work for a cat or a dog or a horse as well. If any of these creatures is healthy and their senses are sound, but they are sleeping, then that living thing in question is not actually hearing or seeing. They're in a state of sleep, but they're potentially hearing, right? Sometimes, I suppose if someone is asleep, if you make a loud enough noise, they'll wake up, but it is also possible, once someone is really asleep, they're really asleep, very hard to wake them up. So that's the only point he's making here, that you've got perception as actual and perception as potential. And so if someone is fast asleep, then we can say that, yes, they have the capacity to hear and see, but at that point, it's only potential, it's not actual. Even though there might be all kinds of sounds going on around them. So just as perception then can be spoken of in two ways, that is to say, in one case as potential and in the other as actual, the same, says Aristotle, can be spoken of the object of perception. The object of perception is also potential or actual. So recently there was that horrible submersible disaster. And so all those guys were out there searching for it. They know there's a submersible out there, but they're not able to perceive it. The instrumentation wasn't picking it up. And, later they said they picked up some sound, whatever, those poor souls are dead, it's finished. They don't have any oxygen. But that's maybe a recent grim example of, yes, you're not able to perceive it. The submersible was potentially perceivable, but the instrumentation wasn't picking it up for whatever reason. It was too deep, it was what have you. Similarly, well, recently when I was in Santa Fe, we were hiking up in the mountains, and I know that there were coyote out there, but I couldn't perceive them. There were definitely coyote on the mountain. And as we were coming down and it started getting darker, I definitely perceived them because I heard them howling, but I didn't see them. But I knew the coyote were there. So again, it's potentiality and actuality.
But you cannot verify the veracity of that object of perception until it is going to be in actuality.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
So can we say that the life, when he described life, is it something that is in actuality? Like if you're sleeping, then according to Aristotle, it might be you are dead because everything is in potentiality that time. So the soul, while you're sleeping,
No, you're not dead. You're not dead when you're sleeping.
Because like he said.
Well, you have a
it's just-
pulse and the person is breathing, even though their breathing rate is slow and all of that, but they're
but
definitely.
nothing is in actuality except that he's breathing. So
But that doesn't mean that the person is no longer alive. He's just analyzing perceptions now. his 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 senses, the five senses, when a person is in a state of deep sleep, are not incapacitated, they're just dormant because the person is in a state of sleep. They are potentially hearing and seeing and tasting and smelling and feeling and touching, but they're not really being used for that. He doesn't deal with dreams here in this, which opens up a whole other.
yeah, because I was just
Because many people have extremely vivid dreams in which they, in all of the senses are at work. They feel, they hear, they smell, it's like an actual waking experience.
I think for him, the actuality, it means you are actively seeking something or contemplating something. It's not like you are just.
Well, again, so for right now, we are engaging in this seminar discussion of the Anima. And so I am not focusing on, the scenery outside this window, but I could. But so all the scenery outside the window, all that totality of perceptible objects, which presents itself at this window, mainly visual, unless they start hammering and making noises and, mowing the lawn or whatever. I'm not focusing on it because I'm focusing on this. Everything is associated with this discussion that's taking place right now. So those things are potential. They're potentially perceivable. I can stop and I can, okay, I can look out the window and daydream and whatever and think about the trees and all the scenes outside, right? So this is the only point he's making. He's making
But
one of
is
potentiality
focus-
and actuality.
Is focus really a shart and a condition?
Yeah.
Like, for example, we're having this conversation, we're focused on this seminar over here, but we're well aware that there is a sound which is emanating from the fan, even though we are not focusing on it. But
Some
there's
people
some
might be focusing. I wasn't focusing. I had shut that out. And now
Yeah,
you've
shut
told
that-
me.
yeah.
Now you've told me. Now,
Now
I'm thinking
you're-
about it. Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, I
no, it makes sense.
when I was in high school here in the United States, I had to ride the school bus to and from.
No.
And it is the habit of the Americans to constantly be listening to the radio when they drive. And now with all of these stupid devices that they have, these Bluetooth things in their brains. But I would never listen to it because I would always do my geometry or calculus or whatever homework it was coming back or read a book. I would completely shut it out. So it's possible to do that, right? So, okay, you say, well, all right. Some of this is involuntary, I suppose. So when I started doing that on the bus, I had to concentrate and work on it. But after a while, it just becomes a thing. Oh, I'm on the bus. It becomes a habit. So again, it's just actuality, potentiality, I think. I think the point on focus is that
Yeah, that's kind of what it is.
that nature, yeah. So he introduces further distinctions on this concept of actuality and potentiality. So on page 33 of the Shield's translation, this is still 417. We're not actually now in 417a, line 22. 417a 22. One must also draw a distinction concerning potentiality and actuality, for we have just now been speaking of them without qualification. In the first case, something is a knower in the way in which we might say that a human knows because humans belong to the class of knowers, and to those things which have knowledge. But in the second case, we say directly that the one who has grammatical knowledge knows. Now let's see how that is in Ibn Rushd, if we can find it. Yeah, so in Ibn Rushd, that's paragraph 163. And in this case, it
Sorry,
matches up.
163 or 162? وَإِذَا قَدْ قِيلَ هَذَا.
Paragraph 163. وَلَمَّا كَانَ قَدْ
Okay.
تَبَيَّنَ. And if you look in the Arabic there, he has the references to Aristotle. He does have 417a21. Here he has chosen to put a mud above the alif. That's one way of doing it. Yeah. Anyway,
And well, what is the mud standing for? Just Aristotle? Aristotle? Or
no, these are the references to the what are they called? The Becker numbers.
the Becker numbers?
Yeah,
Okay.
so here we are in 417a line 20
So there's A.
22. So it's basically this, he's just writing 417a line 21. Yeah, it's just an
Okay.
A.
Okay, it's just an A. You got it.
Anyway, قال ولما كان قد تبين أن الحس منه بالقوة ومنه بالاستكمال. See, here he doesn't say بالفعل, he says بالاستكمال. These words are interesting. فقد ينبغي أن نلخص كيف الأمر في ذلك في الحواس على الإطلاق وعلى العموم. فنقول إنه قد نقول في الشيء إنه حساس إذا كانت فيه القوة التي بها يقدر أن يحس وإن لم يستعمل حواسه بعد. بالفعل. وهذا هو مثل قولنا في الإنسان إنه عالم في الوقت الذي حصلت له ملكة العلم وإن لم يستعمل علمه. So here he didn't give an example of grammar. He just says, al-insan. So basically in the English version of Shields, it says in the first case, in other words, potentially, the case of potentiality, we have, human beings potentially can know any number of things by virtue of them being human beings. And then you have the case of someone who has a particular ilm. Here he just says, إنه عالم في الوقت الذي حصلت له ملكة العلم. So that person is an alim. Here we would maybe say, I don't know what he has in English. He says knowledgeable disposition. I would say such and such a person is a scholar of such and such a subject, or a knower of such and such a thing, once that knowledge has become established in that person. In other words, that has become an aspect of that individual's disposition. So your knowledge of trigonometry has become your malaka. It's a disposition. You know it so well that if they wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning, you should be able to draw a sine curve. I suppose if I ask you in the middle of the heat of a battle, what is the sine of 45 degrees? And you're immediately able to say it's the square root of 2/2, even though the bullets are flying, right? So it becomes a part of you. He says if you've acquired a knowledgeable disposition. So that is, again, actuality and potentiality. This is all a discussion of actuality and potentiality as it relates to perception and the senses one by
so
one.
it seems like actuality and potentiality is going back and forth. So it's not like once you achieve the form, I think like in Mullā Ṣadrā, once you achieve the form, it's not going back to its matter, right? But
It's
here
not going back to its what?
its matter. It's not going to be like previous state, right?
Yeah.
But here it seems like you have to be actually using it, and once you're
Well, it still doesn't go back. I mean, just
if you're not using it,
do you know how to ride a bicycle?
Yeah,
Okay. Well, when was the last time you rode a bicycle?
the stationary one. Yeah,
No,
the
not a
bicycle,
station,
one?
a real bike.
Yeah, no, it's been a long time,
It's been a long time, right? But you know how to do it.
right?
Yeah.
No, but it says once if you're actively seeking
So
something or using it, then it becomes
you've
actual.
acquired the skill to ride a bicycle, but you're not using it right now. But
So is it still in potentiality then? Because I'm not using it.
no, you have it, you've achieved it, but since you're not it's a different sense of actuality.
Yeah.
Since you're not actually riding the bike, but you haven't lost it. You've acquired it as a knowledge. Sorry, a bicycle would be more of a skill.
Right.
You've acquired it as a skill, but you only use that skill when you're on the bike,
Right.
to state the obvious, right? So in that sense, it's potential, as opposed to, let's say, some child who has not yet learned to ride a bike. They haven't acquired that.
So how can
So
we
there are
define
different,
actuality
there are
then in
different,
sense?
different kinds of
Kinds of.
actuality. It's different nuances. It's not even kind, it's a different nuance. It's a different sense of
Sense.
actuality.
So can I quote from the introduction of C.D.C. Reed on
Yeah, if he's
Aristotle?
got
that-
something to help us out, sure.
Yeah.
Whoops.
For a first
Yeah,
potentiality is like the capacity someone has to learn Greek.
Yeah.
And we have the capacity, the ability to learn it. When that capacity is actualized through the acquisition of the ability to speak Greek, then it's first actuality.
Yeah.
So
Right.
capacity to learn it, first potentiality, you
Yeah.
actually learn it, first actuality.
Yeah.
Now, the acquired capacity he has to exercise his acquired ability in actively speaking Greek is a second potentiality.
Yeah.
So the ability to learn first potentiality, now he has the ability to actually speak it after he has learned second potentiality.
Mhm.
And actualizing that second potentiality and actively speaking in turn is a second actualization.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty
So
useful.
these are all the different sort of nuances.
And it's on page 23 of the introduction of CDC.
So now I have the Wisnowski dissertation in front of me.
Oh, excellent.
So
What is the exact title of the dissertation?
it's called Avicenna on Final Causality.
Avicenna on Final Causality.
Avicenna on Final Causality, Ph.D. dissertation. Princeton University, 1994, Common Era. Yeah, so he's collected together a bunch of Arabic terms which we find in Aristotle, in the Arabic Aristotle. And he gives every reference and then how these come into Ibn Sīnā. So on page 10 of this dissertation, under terminology, he said that basically he says this, it's a brief index of the Arabic terms used most often by Avicenna to describe final causation. So we have tamam, which renders the Greek telos, which we may translate as perfection, or he translates as perfection. Then we have again tamam, but this time standing for entelechia, again perception. Then on page 11, again we have tamam, but this time for the Greek teleiosis, again perfection. Then we have غير tamam, or imperfect, for the Greek ateles.
With the E, A. Or I mean, of course, we're speaking.
It's with an E, but you can copy these down later if you want. Then we have the verb tamma, to become perfect, for the Greek verb teleo. And then again we have tammun, for again the Greek teleios, which is perfect. So there's a lot of these terms. This goes on for a few pages. You can look at this. I think you can actually buy this dissertation online, yeah, but it'll cost you about $40 because
I think the same amount if we can want to print this out.
yeah, the problem is I don't want
But
to,
when you say buy a PDF
yeah,
for $40.
yeah, I don't want to break the binding of this. I have had this since 1994. This is an original.
There are scanners that you can just open it and
Hi, but
again.
the pages have come off here and I don't want to. Then you'd have to open that binding, feed it into a machine. If you know some guy who will do it, and then he'll bind that for me again
Yeah.
for free, then we can do it. Okay, I just wanted to make you aware of that. So we were back to this whole discussion of so actuality, potentiality. So obviously there are these different nuances to actuality. And you can speak of first actuality and second actuality as CDC Reeves does, but sometimes they speak of first perfection and second perfection. They speak of first completion and second completion.
Are you aware if
And
Ibn
again,
Sina
and
uses
again
these
in
terms?
Arabic, well, that's what I just told you.
Okay.
And in Arabic, they use kamal with respect to the definition of the soul. So they talk about al-kamal al-awwal wal-kamal al-thani. But according at least to Wisnowski, and you'd have to go and check all of those references. So under each word, there's a bunch of references from the Arabic Aristotle. They're different. There've been translations that have been done in modern times, but the ancient translations in the classical Islamic period of Aristotle into Arabic, there's large parts of the Aristotelian corpus that are out there. That were translated and they've been edited. So he went through those, and then he also compares the relevant parts of, I think, the Shīʿah, Kitab al-Shīʿah, the cure or the healing of Ibn Sina, and looks at all those terms. So it seems that Ibn Sina he uses tamam oftentimes for entelechia, but at other times he will use kamal and istikmal. Okay, so what's happening in Avicenna is that there is a notion of completion, and there's also the notion of perfection, but there's also the notion of an end. So the final cause in Aristotle, in Ibn Sina, is called al-illatul ghā'iyya or al-ghāya. And so sometimes the word ghāya is standing in, again, for some sense of entelechia. And that's why Wisnowski speaks of the Ammonian synthesis, because this commentator, Ammonius Saccas, it's filtering through into the Arabic. There were Arabic versions of these commentaries as well. And Avicenna, according to Wisnowski, read these, and all of that is reflected in his work. So the Kitab al-Shīʿah is extremely important. The whole thing, and it's a big, big, big book. Sayyid Hussain Nasr claims it's the largest encyclopedic work written by a single person. Allahu A'lam, I don't know. But he made that claim in the book Three Muslim Sages, which is an old book, but still it's a nice read. So where are we now? So is that clear? So what you were talking about, actuality, you have to remember, this happens in the English translations as well. Actuality in Greek, in Aristotle's Greek, is entelechia. So sometimes they'll translate it as actuality, but other places it's used as something else. So I think there's no choice. I mean, we need to like put an ad somewhere online and get someone to teach us Greek after we do this, because I am sick of this. Reading all these different translations. It sort of feels like when back in the day, you can all maybe, I can certainly remember when I didn't know Arabic. You know, when you didn't know Arabic, you're like, okay, you read this translation of the Quran or this translation, what is it saying? What's going on? And I feel the same way in reading this or any other Greek philosophical text. So I think there's no choice. So we all have to drop everything we're doing and go and study Greek for a year. Anyway, so until then, going back to so book 5. All right. So the whole point is again about actuality and potentiality. Now let's go a little bit further. Obviously, I'm just focusing on certain passages in these, and I assume you guys have read this already, but there's certain you haven't, go back and do it. But there's just little passages that I'm focusing on page 34. So we're near the end of 417b, just before 418a. He's continuing on with this notion of actuality. And he's talking about sight and hearing, but again, he's speaking of perception in general. Now, here he makes the point that perception is perception of particulars. Maybe we have to read it from the top of the page. He says at the top of the page, from the top of the page, page 34, in what is capable of perceiving, the first change is brought about by the parent. What is born also already has perception, just as we have knowledge. So he's talking about some sort of imparting of knowledge or teaching. Actually, perceiving is spoken of in a way similar to contemplation, but there is a difference. What is capable of producing this actuality, the object of sight and hearing and so forth, for the remaining objects of perception is external. The reason is that actual perception is of particulars, whereas knowledge is of universals. This is a very important point. So I perceive the individual tree or the individual horse or the individual dog. I hear a particular sound, an explosion or thunder, or I don't know, Rag Yaman, or if you prefer Beethoven's Fifth or whatever. All those guys out there who think music is haram, that's a different discussion. Just giving an example here. Or if you hear the wind blowing, or if you perceive a particular fragrance, the fragrance of musk, as opposed to the fragrance of saffron. Or if you are in one part of your house and then you smell the smell of biryani, then probably the food is ready. Your wife has made biryani. Maybe your husband makes biryani. Yeah, you wish, but not gonna happen. So the point is that those are all particulars. Those are all particulars. I mean, is there a general saffron, or is there a general, musk or loban smell? So he's talking about how perception of these things is of particulars. But then once you have had this range of perceptions, you have a knowledge of that, right, in your mind. And similarly, you can abstract from that to universals. So there is a difference between perception qua perception, in as much as perception as such must be of particulars, whereas knowledge is of universals, which are in a sense in the soul itself. So once you have acquired a knowledge through abstraction, you see many instances. If I say to you, what is chivalry? I can point to individual instances of chivalry. The chivalrous act of the classic Kshatriya type, the classic warrior type, and Imam Ali alayhi salam. Of course, he is a Ma'soom, so we don't compare. But a warrior type like Miyamoto Musashi from ancient Japan, or some sort of a chivalrous knight, I can point to individual acts of chivalry. And from that, we have then a concept of chivalry, a concept of futuwa, javan mardi, a concept of another Arabic term would be hilm, which you find in chivalrous persons, a kind of affable indifference to slights, to insults, to adversities. Yeah, you like that, affable indifference. He's writing it down. So that is a knowledge, that's an abstraction. Or similarly, the concept of justice. You can have individual acts of justice or injustice, and from that you abstract a notion of justice or injustice. Or the abstract concept of love. You have individual instances of that from which you abstract it. So that is the knowledge, right? But then the perception is of particulars. That's the point he's making, and it's a very fine point, a very nice point. So he continues, consequently, or let's just read it again. So the reason is that actual perception is of particulars, whereas knowledge is of universals, which are in a sense in the soul itself. That's what we read Now, continuing, consequently, reasoning is up to oneself whenever one wishes, but perceiving is not up to oneself, since it is necessary for the object of perception to be present. This holds in the same way for the types of knowledge which concern objects of perception, and for the same reason, namely that the objects of perception are particulars and are externals. Now, if you've eaten chocolate ice cream in the past, you can imagine the taste. But if you really want to perceive it, you have to have a chocolate ice cream. It's very simple. So now he continues on in this with this line of discussion into chapter 6. Now you have to understand something, and this is why a little bit of background is important, and that's why this book by Carlo Natali is good, very good background. It's sort of the state of the art of scholarship. You know, the Aristotelian corpus, if you get the complete works of Aristotle in 2 volumes, yeah, it's arranged a certain way. I'm not sure that the arrangement in that publication is how it was in the ancient world, but the arrangement that we have is attributed to someone who came much later, named Andronicus of Rhodes. They say that the library of, you know, the writings of Aristotle were inherited by one of his students named Theophrastus, and they kind of lie around, and it's not until much later that they're collected together, and then they end up in the Library of Alexandria and other ancient libraries. But the person who collected them together and ordered them is supposed to be, they say, this guy Andronicus of Rhodes. And that's why the book, The Metaphysics, gets the name Metaphysics, because he put it after the treatises on the physics. So also the chapter divisions within the books were done by, they say, Andronicus of Rhodes. Wallahu a'lam, you know. So right here, when we go into when we're in De Anima, book 2, chapter 6, you'll find that in whatever version Averroes read, there is no book 6. 5 and 6 are the same. And you know, if you read chapter 6, it just seems to be a continuation. You think, why is there another chapter? You know, because the way we organize and write books nowadays, that, you know, a chapter, there should be sort of a logical break. But oftentimes when you read Aristotle, there doesn't seem to be. You know, why are these divisions the way they are? And this is across the board. If you start reading Averroes' different commentaries, if you look at the Metaphysics, there are important differences. There are portions, there are chapters which aren't even there. So you wonder, you know, how much was translated into Arabic, was and even, and we completely rely on what we have with us. You know, there are some people who claim that the Metaphysics, for example, not apparently, you know, some people claim that the parts of it may not even be by Aristotle. So just by way of example, here in the Routledge Philosophy Guidebook to Aristotle and the Metaphysics by Vasilis Politis, says this on the very first page. The work that we have under the title Metaphysics, or the Ta Meta Ta Fusika, is a series of 14 books, all or most of which were written by Aristotle. First sentence in the book. All or most of which. So this is, again, I'm not a specialist in Greek thought. I don't know Greek, but this is a modern, it's a contemporary book. It's floating out there. It's 2004, copyright 2004. And that's the first sentence after the acknowledgements. The work that we have here under the title, The Metaphysics, Ta Meta Ta Fusika, is a series of 14 books, all or most of which were written by Aristotle. Further on, however, Aristotle did not write the Metaphysics as a single work, and even the individual books or sets of books in it may not be finished works. only after his death, and probably between 200 and 100 BC. He died 322 BC. Were these 14 books arranged and published in the order in which we now have them? The title itself, the Metaphysics, is not Aristotle's, but was probably devised by Andronicus of Rhodes when he put together the edition of the collected works of Aristotle, sometime in the 1st century BCE. So whatever is said here about the metaphysics in this book more than likely applies mutatis mutandis, Latin phrase meaning the necessary changes or modifications being made, to the Anima as well. So what's happening then in chapter 6, or the continuation of chapter 5? Just continuing to talk about perception. In the case of each sense, it is necessary to speak first about perceptible objects. So first he's talking about perception in general. Now he wants to discuss each of the senses. He's going to begin with sight. But before he begins again, he says, if we're going to talk about each of the senses, we need to talk about perceptible objects. And perceptible objects, the percepts, the sensibilia, in Arabic, in Ibn Rushd, I think he says al-mahsusat. Perceptible objects are spoken of in 3 ways. In 2 cases, we say perceptible objects are perceived in their own right, and in 1 coincidentally. Of the first 2, one is exclusive to an individual sense and the other common to them all. By exclusive, I mean what cannot be perceived by another sense and about what one cannot be deceived. For example, the sight is of color, hearing is of sound, and taste is of flavor, whereas touch has a number of different objects. In any case, each sense discerns these and is not deceived, and that there is color or that there is sound, as opposed to what or where the colored or sounding thing is. Accordingly, these sorts of objects are said to be exclusive to each sense. Does that make any sense to you? Yeah. So again, Ibn Rushd is easier. So the division where what corresponds to chapter 6 in Shields in Ibn Rushd is on page 64, paragraph 170. 170. Here he says, وإذ قد تكلم في الانفعال المسمى حسا بأمر عام فينبغي أن نتكلم في المحسوسات أيضا بأمر عام ثم نصير بعد ذلك إلى ما يخص حاسة فنقول إن المحسوسات تقال على 3 ضروب. Notice 3 is also spelled the ancient way here, ancient orthography without the alif. وذلك أنها تنقسم أولا إلى ما هو محسوس بالذات وإلى ما هو محسوس بالعرض، والمحسوس بالذات ينقسم إلى ما هو مشترك لجميعها وإلى ما هو خاص بواحد من الحواس. فأما الخاص فهو مثل اللون للبصر والصوت للسمع والطعم للحس الذوقي والحر والبارد الحس اللمسي، والمشتركة هي الحركة والسكون والعدد والشكل والمقدار، فإن هذه تدركها كلها جميع الحواس. In other words, he's saying that the perceptible objects do not cross over to the senses. You don't see a smell and you don't hear a color and so forth. Yeah. So there's a particular class of, in other words, a given perceptible object is perceived only, or one dimension of it is. I mean, so for example, if you had, there are things which you can taste, right? So if you have a watermelon, you can see the watermelon, you can touch the watermelon, you can smell the watermelon, you can taste the watermelon. Right, so that's one perceptible object, and potentially, I mean, you could take a clump of dirt, you could taste it as well. I mean, it's not advisable, but the point is that there are there are mahsusat, which are specific to each his, that they don't cross over. But then there are things which are mushtarak among the senses. And those are, he says, those are, where is it? Motion, rest, number, shape, magnitude. That's all he's saying.
No, what exactly does that mean that they're mushtarak amongst the different, hawas? Like, how is haraka, sukun, something which is common amongst all of the hawas? How would you explain that?
Because you can sense motion.
Mhm.
You can see it. You can sense if you're
Okay.
moving.
Okay,
All
right.
But there's an important, so in the Ibn Rushd version on page 65, there's a footnote. It's footnote number 15. And if you follow that footnote, it's actually not a footnote, strictly speaking, it's an endnote. So unfortunately, you have to stop whatever you're doing. You have to go to the back of the book. So it's the Anima footnote 15 on page 178. So Averroes here, he's saying, believes he is following Thinnistius, and he tells you where the reference is, who paraphrases the first of Aristotle's two comments on the common sensibles, al-mahsusat al-mushtaraka. And then he tells you that in the long commentary he says something else, and so forth. So I'm not sure how particularly useful this is, but the key point is here is that Averroes distinguishes between motion, rest, and number, which he says are perceived by all the senses. Motion, rest, and number. And shape and size, which are supposedly perceived only by the faculties of sight and touch.
And by number, he means.
So by number, I
Yeah.
think he has some sense of quantity.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Whereas, so you can tell that a dozen onions is going to be heavier, shall we say, than one onion. So I'm not even going into modern ideas of like, I mean, they had weights and measures before as well. So I'm not going to say kilograms or pounds or anything like that. Just the basic sense without introducing any kind of system of weights or measures. And I can sense that this wall is further away from me than the edge of this table. And moreover, the houses that I can see through the window across the street are further away from me than this computer screen. So that's a quantity, and there's relationship as well. I think that's what he means. So that didn't really seem to add much. That's why I think it's probably justifiable that chapter 6 is really just chapter 5. Yeah. So 5 and 6 are really one chapter. So then in what follows in chapter 7, he's talking about sight. Chapter 8 is going to be sound, hearing. Then 9, it's going to be smell. And he says smell is a bit trickier. And then 10 is going to be taste. And then we've got touch and the tangible in chapter 11. And then he kind of has a summation on perception and perceptual forms. It's in 12, it's a kind of a repetition of what has gone before. And then he leaves it there. And then after that, we get into book 3. And book 3, chapter 1, he says that there is no other sense beyond these 5. I mean, these sight, hearing, smelling, taste, and touch. One might feel confident on the basis of the following considerations, and then he gets into the whole other thing. So, I mean, we can talk a little bit about each of these just briefly, but I think the rest of this is pretty readable. So that of which there is sight is the visible. Now he says something interesting here. He says the visible is both color and something of which it is possible to describe in words, but which has no name. What does that mean? So if we look in the Arabic, the chapter on sight, and it actually has a title here, which is not here in the English version of Shields. It's actually called the chapter on sight, or the statement, or the remark. In Arabic, it doesn't say al-bab. It says al-qawl. Al-qawlu fil basar. والمحسوس الذي ينسب إلى البصر من جهة أنه خاص به هو المرئي. والمرئي هو اللون بالحقيقة. And again, a goofy spelling. He should have fixed this, and he even puts a footnote. Like, what's the point, man? وما يرى, it should be. Then that imla of yura is just hideous.
Was this there in ancient orthography?
I
This
don't
type of
know.
image?
I don't know.
I've never
It doesn't
seen
really
this.
matter. I mean, it only makes sense if you say wama yura, and that which is seen. Here he says, those things which are visible but colorless. Wama yura, it has to be yura, can't be yara. So wama yura mimma laysa lahu lawnun wala lahu ismun يعم جميع مثل الأشياء التي ترى في الظلمة. So the sensible object which is related to sight is peculiar to it is that which is visible. The truly visible is color. Those things which are visible but colorless, like the things which are visible in the dark, have no comprehensive term. That's what it means. Because here it says that perceptual objects are spoken of in three ways. That of which there is sight is the visible. The visible is both color and something which it is possible to describe in words, but which has no name.
Things which are visible but colorless.
It's if you see them in darkness or dim light. That's what comes out from reading Ibn Rushd, right? Those things which are visible but colorless, like the things which are visible in the dark, have no comprehensive term, and they are not visible by the intention through which color is said to be visible. Okay, do you agree that the visible is color?
Visible is color.
Yeah, that's what he's talking about.
You know, I'd have to reflect on that.
You gotta think about it.
Um,
So if we're talking about the sense of sight, everything we see has some kind of a color. We may differ about how those colors are named, and indeed there are differences among different languages about color. In fact, I have an entire dictionary. It's a small one. It's called a Dictionary of Colors in Arabic, color names. There's a whole kind of childish debate now on the internet, but those of us who are involved in the study of languages knew this before TikTok and all this stupid stuff was invented. In other words, there's a debate over blue and green. And in Chinese, sometimes, there's a character which is, they'll say it's blue, but other people will say it's green, and this actually has to do with, they argue with some aspect of perception and so forth. So I don't want to get into that argument, but the fact is that whether it's blue or green, it is recognized as a color. Have you seen anything that doesn't have a color? Yeah, so then we say it's transparent, water,
yeah.
glass, but otherwise things have a color. So it comes down to that the actual percept, the mahsus of al-basar is al-lawn bil-haqiqa, as Ibn Rushd says.
And transparency comes under al-lawn as well. Matalan, water.
No, it has no lawn.
It has no lawn.
Yeah, so that doesn't really have a word, because
But
if you
we
talk
perceive
about
it with our
water,
sight as well.
al-ma'u jawharun sayyalun
Yeah.
la lawna lahu yatalawwanu bilawni ina'ihi.
Mm.
So water is a flowing or liquid substance which has no color but takes on the color of the vessel containing it. And indeed, the visual apparatus in the normally functioning human being has physiological apparatus that distinguishes color. I think they call them rods and cones or something like this. Those of you who are more educated in biology will know this. And we do have, unfortunately, the phenomenon that some people are born, la qadar Allah, with what is called color blindness. And if you are colorblind, you might think, oh, well, you just see it in black and white. I was reading about this. It's not really true. There's different ranges, but it is a problem.
Some people can't differentiate between particular colors.
Yeah, but it's a problem. So, you know, if you're driving and you can't distinguish and you can't tell if it's a red light or a green light, you're in trouble. Or, you know, other things could happen. I mean, so that means that your perception is considerably, your visual sense is considerably hampered. Right. So so when you say that color is the essence of vision, he's correct.
There's a funny story of somebody I knew who was colorblind. So in America, it is a standard on most places to have the red, yellow, and green in a particular order. But he went internationally somewhere, Canada and whatnot, and over there it was complete reversed.
Oh,
so you know,
you mean nothing traffic lights?
Yeah, nothing dangerous happened. That is very interesting. Yeah.
So that's the essence of vision. He's focusing on color, but there's also a discussion of light. And in the Arabic, this is all sort of shifted around if you read them together. So, yeah, unless it's really vague and difficult to understand, I think we'll just read the English here. So he says the visible is color. And that which is on the surface of what is visible in its own right, not by definition, but because it contains within itself the cause of its being visible. Every color is capable of setting in motion that which is actually transparent. In other words, affecting. So if you have a sheet of glass and you put it over and some colored thing, then you perceive the color in the glass. And why do you do that? Well, because light passes through glass. So consequently, nothing is visible without light. Rather, the color of each thing is always in light. Accordingly, one must say first what light is. There is, to be sure, the transparent. By transparent, I mean that which is visible, not strictly speaking in its own right, but due to the color of something else. Of this sort are air. Air is a transparent medium. Water. And many solids. Obviously, he has in mind glass, crystal, so forth. Of this sort are air, water, and many solids. These are not transparent insofar as they're air or water, but because there is an indwelling nature, which is the same in them both, as well as in the everlasting body above. And light is the actuality of this. So again, he's involved with actuality and potentiality everywhere. And again, it would be really interesting to see what it is in Greek in every single instance. But light is the actuality of this. The transparent insofar as it is transparent. Where this is, there is also potentially darkness. Light is a sort of color of the transparent. Whenever it is made in actuality transparent by fire or something that is like the body above, for something one and the same belongs to this and to fire. Now, does Reeves say the same thing?
Reeves.
Check Reeves. It should be book 2, chapter 7, about 418b3.
Or 18b3. What can perceive is potentially such as the perceptible object already is actually, as has been said.
If
It is affected then as being not like the object.
where's light? There's something about light and transparency.
Let's go.
Should be after that.
Things, though, are said to be perceptible objects in 3 ways.
Okay, let me see. You got it.
Yeah. For every color is capable of causing movement in what is actually transparent.
Yeah.
And this is its nature. That is why it is not visible without light, but rather the color of each thing is always seen in light, which is why we must first say what light is. there is then something transparent. And by transparent, I mean what is indeed visible, although not intrinsically visible, simply speaking, but rather visible because of the color of something else, air, water, and many solid bodies, etc., etc. So yeah, I guess in some
where does he say actuality? Keep going, because there's an indwelling, yeah.
Air, water, and many solid bodies are of the source. For it is not insofar as something is water or insofar as it is air that it is visible, but because there is a certain nature in it that is the same in both of them and in the eternal body above. And light is the activity of this.
You see?
Here it says light is the perfection of the transparent, right?
Here it says perfection in Arabic, perfection of the transparent. Where is that in the Arabic?
Oh, I'm saying it's just gonna be here.
No, you just tell me the page, I'll find it. It's 67.
67. That's better.
Yeah, so he's referring to the transparency of the heavens again. That doesn't come out in the English. Maybe if you read all the commentary of Shields, which I'm just not too interested in. But he says here, in the everlasting body above. وهذه الطبيعة هي موجودة في الجسم الأبدي أعني السماوي. In other words,
sorry, you had asked about the original Greek word for perception.
Yeah,
it is aesthesis. Yeah,
aesthesis. So, he's talking about al-ashya' al-shaffafa, transparent things, and he's saying that you have to understand that for the ancients, the heavenly bodies moved within certain spheres, and these spheres were considered to be translucent and transparent. That's why it says the heavenly body above, and that's clear in Ibn Rushd, but it's kind of left vague here. The everlasting body above. Al-jism al-abadi ani as-samawi.
What is the Arabic term for translucent? Is it just a shaffaf?
So he says, وهذه الطبيعة هي موجودة في الجسم الأبدي أعني السماوي. Why does he say abadi? Why does he say everlasting? They don't tell you that either. Because everything in our world is in the sublunar world. We're in the sphere below the moon. Sublunar is al-alam al-sifli. And in al-alam al-sifli, that's alam al-kawn wal-fasad. The world or the realm of generation and corruption. Al-alam al-ulawi is not the realm of the four elements. The heavenly bodies are not composed of the four elements. They're composed of the fifth element, the quinta essentia. And because there's no kawn and fasad there, that's why they're abadi. It's a very small point. This stuff, people don't believe in these things now. But if you want to understand what is in the text, that's what it means. Anyway, so light is the perfection activity. So in Arabic, he says, فَأَمَّا الضَّوْء. He doesn't say an-nur. This is also important in Arabic. فَأَمَّا الضَّوْء فَهُوَ كَمَالُ هَذِهِ الطَّبِيعَةِ. So it's the perfection qua-transparent, perfection of the transparent qua-transparent. It's the perfection, but it's also the actualization, because he says فهو كمال هذه الطبيعة وفعلها أعني أن الضوء هو كمال المشفع من جهة ما هو مشفع. Very interesting
and confusing.
Light is the actuality of this, the transparent, insofar as transparent. Light is the sort of color of the transparent. In other words, he's saying light is a kind of actuality because if there is no light, then you see nothing.
So transparent is not darkness then.
Yeah.
And by opposite, would that make darkness a potentiality?
Because but darkness is the absence of light. So But potentiality, it means that they have a capacity to accept light.
Yeah,
And
it has the capacity to
so
accept
the
the
darkness does not
to
have a
accept
capacity
one
to
light.
accept. That's why it's darkness.
Yeah, that's why it's darkness, but the things do have the capacity.
No, darkness itself does not have the
Darkness as
capacity.
such, it doesn't,
Yeah,
but the things
darkness
have
as
the
such
capacity to
Yes.
absorb some part of light and reflect the other part of light, and the reflected part is the color that we, at least that's the theory of vision right now. So this is how he deals with each of these senses. But again, you see the discussion of actuality and potentiality is always being invoked in some way or another. So now if you look at chapter 8, he says, let us first determine the facts concerning sound and hearing. There is sound in two ways. Notice how Aristotle is always very careful. It's like, okay, the word sound, there's two senses, or there's three senses. He's always very careful to look at the terms, logical terms. There's sound in two ways, as something actual and as something potential. Once again, we deny that some things have sound. Sponge and wool do not have sound, and affirm that other things have it. Bronze and whatever is solid and smooth. What does that mean? It means that if you have a sponge or a clump of wool, you can't get sound out of it by hitting it with a stick, for example. Whereas if you have bronze or something solid and smooth, even if you have like a piece of wood, you can hit against it. So this is something solid and smooth. It's a piece of marble. I can produce some kind of sound through some kind of mechanical activity. So he says that actual sound always occurs as the sound of something in relation to something and in something. For what produces it is an impact. Accordingly, it is also impossible for sound to occur when there is just one thing, since what strikes and what is struck are different. So that what makes a sound does so in relation to something. And without movement, no impact occurs. Still, as we said, it is not an impact of whatever happens to be around, for if one were to strike wool, no sound would be made. Rather, it is bronze and whatever is smooth and hollow. Bronze because it is smooth, while hollow things produce many impacts after the first by reverberating, since what has been set in motion is unable to escape. So in the context of, let's say, musical instruments, you have percussive instruments. What is a percussive instrument? You're hitting it in some way, right? Or there's, and in some cases when the thing which is being struck also produces some kind of vibration or an echo. So in the case of a drum, you may hit the surface of the drum with your hand or with some kind of another implement, some kind of a drumstick, and then the drum, usually made of some kind of skin or some other material, produces sound through some kind of vibration. You might have some kind of a metal that is being struck. Sometimes you have strings, but again, strings, they may not necessarily be struck, but they are being plucked in some way or another. A taut string is plucked. You may have some sort of an object which is hollow, but then air is forced through the hollow portion, and other maybe kind of holes and whatnot are made in that cavity so that you produce either a flute or some other kind of instrument. The weirdest is probably the Shīʿah, very characteristic Indian instrument that makes it. But anyway, so the range of these musical instruments across the world is quite varied. You also have the wind. When it blows through certain kinds of natural landscape or terrain, it produces sounds of various kinds, right? So there's always something involved in something else making the sound. What about the sound of gunfire? Why does it make the sound?
You pull the trigger, the force, the velocity of the bullet coming out of it after it's released from the latch.
Well, first of all, there's also an explosion. So there's going to be a natural sound. But one reason that a lot of these guns are so loud is because the projectile, as it emerges, it's going faster than the speed of sound.
Yeah, the velocity.
Yeah. So I don't know that if he would have dealt with that, but again, it's a phenomenon of the air. It's a phenomenon of something moving against the air. So his argument would still stand in the sense that there's always two elements involved. It's not just one thing all by itself. So I suppose to that degree,
the two elements.
to that degree, it seems to be quite sound. What about you have a sound, but then you get another sound? That's the case of the echo. That's 419b 25. An echo occurs whenever air, having become a unit because a confining receptacle precludes its dispersing, rebounds like a ball. It seems likely that an echo always occurs, though it is indistinct, since things surely turn out in the case of sound, so they do in the case of light, for light is always reflected. So there's a reflection of sound, there's a reflection of light. That's also interesting. So light is reflected by mirrors. He says it's reflected, and mirrors in the ancient world would have been metal, some kind of metal, a very shiny metal. Light is reflected in water as well. Other kind of smooth objects have weird light reflective effects. Certain kinds of rocks, if you have a drop of oil on water, it reflects. Sometimes you can see different colors. The same thing, by the way, occurs if you have a liver. If you take a liver from a cow, for example, or some other animal, they're very shiny and translucent, and there's reflection. And this is where the ancients, there was actually the notion of divination through looking at livers in the ancient world. And the experts in liver divination were the very mysterious ancient people known as the Etruscans, about which we don't know anything very much, or we don't know very much because they've gone extinct. But the ancient Romans highly prized the skills of the Etruscans in liver divination. There's a weird little footnote for you. So this is all just a discussion then of sound and the varieties of things that produce sound. So again, this is a very sort of detailed analysis of perception of the senses and the objects, or the sensibilia, the objects of the senses. In chapter 9, he turns to smell. Matters concerning smell and the object of smell are less easy to determine than those that have already been discussed. So he's already discussed sight and hearing. It's not clear what sort of thing smell is, not in the way that it is in the case of sound and color. So of course, now there's all sorts of different theories about smell, the dispersion of molecules and this kind of thing, and so on and so forth. So why is it more difficult with smell? It's because we do not have this sense with precision. Other animals do have it with precision, and he notes that. He says, we are inferior to many animals, for humans smell things weakly, do not perceive any object of smell without its being painful or pleasant, because the sensory organ is imprecise. It's not the case with dogs, and it's certainly not the case with cats. Cats are always sniffing everything. So the different animals, they have a more developed sense of smell. So in terms of its imprecision, he notes that smell is also analogous to taste, and the kinds of flavors are similarly analogous to the kinds of smell, but we have a more precise sense of taste because of its being a sort of touch. And this is the sense which is most precise in humans. So what are the tastes? They're sweet and sour and
bitter.
Yeah, salty. I think that's a taste. Recently, they've introduced another one they've taken a word from Japanese. Umami, I think, is a taste. Yeah, I mean, there are words and there are words in other languages, but so he gets into all this. Some flavors are sweet, others are bitter. So it is with smells. Though in some cases, smell and flavor correspond. I mean, the sort of thing with a sweet smell and a sweet flavor. So this is again with eating, with meals and so forth, with gastronomy. Obviously smell and taste go together, especially with human beings, because they're, you know, the nose and the mouth and this tongue and all are all connected. So smells, unlike flavors, are not especially clear. They have taken their names from things by way of likeness. A sweet smell from saffron or honey, right? In English, at least, we certainly say that it has a sweet smell. Then we speak of a pungent smell from other things. So he makes a similarity with hearing. He says it is also the case that smell is like hearing in each of the other senses. Hearing is of the audible and inaudible. Sight is of the visible and invisible. And smelling is of the scented and the unscented. Some things are unscented on account of its being generally impossible that they have a smell, and others because of their having a slight or weak smell. I'm sure in modern science they have different explanations for smell and so forth, but I don't think we have anything analogous here like we did with sound. So there doesn't seem to be any deep discussion of actuality and potentiality here, but you could, you know, things you could potentially smell something, actually smell something, and so forth.
Yeah.
So taste is chapter 10. You have to have something tangible. And it is for this reason not perceptible through the medium of a foreign body, since touch does not come about this way. And the body in which the flavor is, the object of taste, is in moisture, which is its matter. So if there's no moisture, it's almost impossible to taste something. Okay, again, like I said, there's not any terribly extraordinarily profound stuff that goes on here.
The discussion of actuality and potentiality.
Yeah, so now we come to that. Why is actuality and potentiality important? Why is he looking at things this way? And I think he's part of this now. He just wants to be complete and say, okay, look, I'm going to give at least that's what he says at the beginning. He wants to give a complete account of the soul. So he has to give a complete account of the powers of the faculties of the soul. So we have to go through this whole discussion of seeing and hearing and tasting and so on and so forth. But then in chapter 12, which is the last, he's kind of recapitulating. He says, it is necessary to grasp concerning the whole of perception generally, that perception is what is capable of receiving perceptible forms without the matter, as wax receives the seal of a signet ring without the iron or gold. It acquires the golden or the metallic seal, but not insofar as it is gold or metal. So if you're impressing a seal into wax, it requires that seal, but not insofar as the seal is gold or metal. In a similar way, perception is also in each case affected by what has the color or taste or sound, but not insofar as each of these is said to be something, but rather insofar as each is of a certain quality and corresponding to its proportion. The primary sense organ is that in which this sort of potentiality resides. The sense organ and this potentiality are then the same, though their being is different. For what does the perceiving is a certain magnitude, nevertheless being capable of perception is not. Nor is perception a magnitude, but is rather a certain proportion and a potentiality of that thing. It is evident from these considerations why excesses in the objects of perception destroy the sensory organs. If something is too loud, your hearing is going to be impaired. If something is too bright, your vision will be impaired. So, there's a great wisdom in the limitation of the range of our senses. If they were unlimited, we would be overwhelmed by the Sensibilia and we would be destroyed. So, you know, you can only take in so much, right? And so there's a wisdom in that limitation, and that's the concept of proportionality that he's talking about here. And this is why plants do not perceive, even though they have one psychic part, and are affected in a way by the objects of touch, since they are cooled and heated. The reason is that they do not have a mean, nor do they have a sort of principle for receiving the forms of perceptible things. Rather, they are affected with matter.
Yeah.
Someone might raise a difficulty as to whether what cannot smell can be affected by odor in any way, or what cannot see by color, and similarly for the other cases. If the object of smell is odor, if it produces anything, then odor produces smelling, so that nothing is incapable of smelling can be affected by odor. And the same argument applies to the other senses. Nor can what is capable of perceiving perceive, except insofar as it is the case capable of perceiving. This is also immediately clear in this way. Neither light and darkness, nor sound, nor odor affects bodies in any way. Rather, that in which they are does. For example, it is the air accompanying thunder which splits timber. So he goes through this whole thing, and he just sort of concludes there. Continuing on that sort of line of questioning, this line of inquiry that, you have to have something tangible to affect the sense of touch. Smelling, again, it involves being affected by some sort of odor, and it's a kind of perception, and et cetera, and then he just sort of stops.
Yeah.
What then is smelling beyond being affected by something? Or is smelling also perceiving, whereas the air which is affected quickly becomes something perceptible? ? End of book 2.
Yeah. So I think in this regard, Shield's introduction, Roman numeral 32, the chapter on perception, is pretty handy. So if you go onwards to page 34, he gives the scheme of perception, if we were to say, of Aristotle.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, a perceiving subject perceives some sensible object if and only if that subject S has the capacity requisite for receiving O sensible form.
Right.
So the sensible form acts upon the capacity by informing it, and then C becomes isomorphic with the sensible form.
Yeah.
But then later on, he makes a nice observation. If we turn 2 pages later to page Roman numeral 36 at the bottom.
Yeah, at the bottom.
He says, properly speaking, Aristotle is keen to distinguish the faculty of perception, aesthetikon, from the organ of perception,
aestheterion.
Yeah.
Aestheterion, yeah.
And to suggest that the capacity or potential dunamis for perceiving, while in the organ, is nonetheless distinct
from it.
So I think that's a very important point.
Very important point. Now, so my question now to you is, if all of that is true, and potentiality and actuality, so far he's only discussed these 5 senses. What about intellect? I think that's where he's going.
No.
I think that's where he's going. So just as we have sense and sensibilia, we have perception and we have percepts, I think is the word in English, the objects perceived, al-mahsusat, al-hawas al-khamsa wal-mahsusat, 5 senses, and the things and the objects of sense, 5 of the sense perception of the 5 senses. We also have the intelligence or the intellect, and we have intelligibles. And I think that's where he's going. And so then there's also potentiality and actuality. So if the eye is actually seeing, and you're actually, yes, then that is actualization of the eye. So then the question is that if we have the intellect, we have the nous, and I think all of this has to be dealt with in the subsequent book. So you have the intellect, and it has intelligibles or objects of intellection. So there also you have the whole dynamics of potentiality and actuality.
No.
And the ancients had a notion of something called the actual intellect, or the activated intellect, or the active intellect, or al-aql al-fa'al, that explained how we have these knowledge of universals, which he only sort of alludes to in that one little section portion we read. Do you remember? This is important, so let's be sure. So again, we're in book 2. Book 2, so it's on page 34 in Shield's translation. The reason is that actual perception is of particulars, whereas knowledge is of universals.
Yes.
So that's 417b 23. Yeah, I think it's 22, 23, something like that. So these senses only directly perceive particulars. That's not true of the intellect. It's the intellect that perceives universals, and that is the thing that truly distinguishes the human being and the human being's soul, because the soul of the human being is the rational soul, an-nafs an-natiqa. So the thing that distinguishes the human being is not the five senses.
But to reach to
Any
that
animal, a
insight, you
camel
need to-
has five senses, right?
But you need to have those five senses to reach to the intellect, right? Or you are saying that in absence of these five senses, we're still going to call that person a Haram.
No, you're not.
So
Because, very good. Because the rational soul, which is the human soul, subsumes the capacities of the other souls. And this is not explained in Aristotle. So on the one hand, you have the intellect, but how do I arrive at the natural universal of tree or man unless I can perceive this individual man and this individual man and this individual man and this individual tree and so forth? So this is not really gone into in Aristotle.
these five senses are kind of potentialities for the intellect.
They are necessary for the intellect. So this is again what's there in Mullā Ṣadrā, but I don't see in Ibn Sīnā, and of course not Ibn Sīnā. Sorry, we're talking about Aristotle, which I don't see in Aristotle. And Aristotle is not allowing for movement or motion or change or haraka in the category of substance. And he says that the soul, he says that the psuche is a johar, is a substance. And then he says, it's the completion and so on. So the definition, which you looked at in the beginning in book 2, chapter 1. Sadra is saying, no, change does occur. It does undergo change. And the movement of actuality and potentiality is there. But it seems to me, I don't know, I could be wrong, that Aristotle seems to be saying that, okay, you've got these senses. They have potential, they can be potential and actual in different ways. Again, the problem is we're using the word entelechia every time. Entelechia has these ambiguities. So the same would seem to apply to the intellect, to the nous. And if that's true, if that is true, then the nous is also, or the aql, the intellect would also then be subject to a kind of a process of moving from actuality, potentiality to actuality. And if that is identified with really what the soul is, if that's really the human soul as a nafs an-natiqa, then you have to say that there is change in that, if you say it's a substance in the category of substance. And then the soul, in that sense, comes into being with the body. But at that point, it is pure potential. Any number of things can happen. So when the child immediately is born, it's true that there are certain innate capacities. Some kids are more talented in one way. Some may be more physically fit. Some guy will be, he can run faster. He can be a gymnast. He can be a tennis player. He can be a ski jumper. Another, all of that is there. But those things are all potential. The child, as soon as it is born in the maternity ward, let's say he's going to be a great skier, doesn't know skiing at that point. Or he's going to be a great chemist. He doesn't know chemistry at that point. Those things have to be taught. Those potentialities, they have to be brought out. Must have access to the five senses to do that, especially if it's a physical activity like skiing. But let's say it's a purely abstract. Let's take the most abstract subject there is, mathematics, pure mathematics.
Yeah.
Do you think you're going to get to the notion of do you think you're going to get to it's an abstract notion of magnitude unless you have some notion of distance? It's not possible. So you have to study some sort of geometry before you can abstract from that notion of geometry.
It's the movement from the concrete to the abstract.
The movement from the concrete to the abstract, but for that you need the senses.
Yeah.
You need the senses. So you have to start with basic geometry and arithmetic before you can get to some completely abstract multi-dimensional algebraic geometry,
Yeah.
something like this, right?
It's like what is stated in the beginning of Mantiq al-Mudaffar, that the hawas al-khamsa, that knowledge which one gains from that, is ra'su mal. It is the what can we say, the
Sense perception is the capital,
The
as it were,
capital,
of
yeah.
knowledge.
Yeah.
Ra's mal means capital
Yeah, exactly.
in modern
Yeah.
Arabic. So the soul in the beginning needs the senses. Now I'm going to give you a very interesting example. You know that in Chinese civilization and the other surrounding areas that were heavily affected by Chinese civilization, even though they're not ethnically Chinese, like the Koreans and Japanese and so forth. This thing is a big deal for them, at least even now in modern times. The abacus. And it's a very mechanical way of doing. It's very good for addition and subtraction. It's not very good for multiplication and division. Right. So they have these abacus schools. You can even go on YouTube and you can find them. They move these things around and they use them. After a while, people who are trained in this, they don't need it anymore. They just do it in, yeah, it's a mental math, but it's not mental math like we do. We're doing, okay, cross this out, carry the one.
They're still like
They're seeing this in their mind, and some of them, because they're used to moving their fingers, they're moving their fingers, but there's no thing there. There's no ala. It's just doing this. So they've gotten to that point where it's just abstract now. So they needed that ala, that extension of that, but they don't need it at a certain point. So similarly, if you become very good in a particular discipline, as they say, you're able to find the middle term and you can do the syllogism, and of course, in other words, you arrive at the conclusion immediately. I mean, if you have taught freshman calculus for 35 years, those integral formulas and everything are in your head, and you can do it in your sleep. And that's why, like, oh, okay, you're teaching, the kid goes to the board, like, oh, okay, he's totally going to screw this up. And then you just sort of wait, let them finish, and then you explain it. So my point is, the person needed the senses at that point. So there is this idea then in Islamic philosophy that if you develop the soul's capacities properly, when you die, when you were born, it's a pure potentiality. When you die, it becomes pure actual, and you don't need the body.
Yeah.
That's why the great saints and the awliya, and of course the ma'sumin are in a category by themselves, but even a ghair ma'sum, when they're dead, they become very powerful. If they fully actualize those things, the ruh of that person is a ruh mujarrad at that point. And we know the famous biography in Persian, Ruh Mujarrad, you know this one, Ruh al-Mujarrad, Hashim al-Haddad. He's an example. But there are many such people. Of course, modern Orientalists will say all that stuff is just nonsense. It's hagiography. But if you read in Persian the famous book by Fariduddin Attar, Tazkiratul Awliya, and there are many books, like there's many stories about awliya, and there's many accounts, even now in modern time. Whether you believe in it, have you seen Shīʿah? Qudratullah Shihab ki kitab Urdu. It's a book in Urdu by a Pakistani diplomat, something who was from Kashmir, and he just writes his life story, and he had a lot of very peculiar spiritual experiences, and he talks about how he was initiated into a Sufi tariqah. So it's a very interesting book, actually, in Urdu. I have not read it cover to cover. I've only, my mother actually pointed out the book to me, and she read to me the relevant portions. But so there are many examples of this, of people, of the spiritual realm. So if there's anything so the point is that if you take this hylomorphic doctrine, okay, it makes sense with these five senses and so forth, but there is something that survives, and that, again, I would say is the intellect. And that's the ruh, if you prefer, and you can talk about the different terms, but there is a something. There is a something which is there afterwards, after the body is gone. But it's different. And it's worth looking at what Plato also said about these. That's why this book is very useful. I mean, if you just have like a little book and you want to read it on the bus or the subway or whatever. So there's all these different passages from Plato in here. And he cites the references, so you can go back if you have the complete works of Plato and mark those sections. because Plato has a different idea, or so it seems, or so it seems. Again, because it's about terms, terminology, and how those things are elaborated, and this stuff all happened a long time ago. And you can see even now with someone, a great scholar like Christopher Shields, when we read this, and then we compare with Averroes, and we read C.D.C. Reeves, and there's problems with terminology. I don't know if you were here the first time. No, you weren't here the first day. But in chapter 1, he talks about how some of the ancients said that the soul is a fire. Well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then I explained that fire can also have the sense of like burning motes or lights, because he gives the example of motes. And we talk about that hadith of the Umud al-Nur, which is there in the hadiths of the Ahl al-Bayt, and which was there in the sayings of Sahal ibn Abdullah Tustari, and is brought out by Gerhard Böhring in his book on a mystical vision of existence. So the terms have these different senses over time, and sometimes we forget what the terms mean. You know, I remember I gave the example of that work by Cornford and that article by Sayyid Hussein Nasr when he talks about how Mullā Ṣadrā recognizes the water of life of Thales is actually Nafas al-Rahman. So anyway, there's a lot of things to think about here, but that's why the Anima is very important. It's very influential on later Islamic thought, and inshallah, as we move forward, we'll try and meet. You know, maybe we'll devote another 3 sessions, and then we'll be done, I think. But there's a lot to talk about, especially in book 3. And once we finish that, if you like, then we can read the Anima of Avicenna. And when we finish that, then maybe we can go to volume 8 and 9 of the Asfar. Keep it going. So, anything else? Anything else we want to?
The question I have is, once the ruh, so we are defining ruh is the perfection for a time being.
Yeah.
So
The
once,
completion.
yeah. So
The first
once,
perfection.
so each individual, for suppose they actualized and become the intellect of the ruh, how you find the difference among them? What is the basis of being different once they all are actualized?
Well, so if we take at the very basic level that the soul is just the first completion, or kamal awwal, let's use the Arabic term, that just means that the thing is alive.
Right.
Everybody is alive who's alive. It's just a
No, I'm
tautology.
talking about when
A
it's
baby
like
is
away
alive,
from
a
the body.
90-year-old man is
Yeah.
alive. Yeah, they're all alive, but they all have different capacities. So there's second and so forth. There's further completions and perfections.
I'm talking about after that.
So everybody works at a different capacity. If there various people have potential for evil, people have potential for evil, right? So people who have cultivated the evil in themselves, when they die, you know, Bernard Lewis, Bill Gates, Benjamin Netanyahu, these guys have been cultivating other things in their character. When they die, they will be confronted by the dark shadow of their deeds. But great holy personages, Allama Tabatabai rahimahullah, Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, Jalaluddin al-Rumi, Mu'ayyinuddin Chishti, Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, these people, when they die, they're in a completely different state.
No, that state is because
So they have developed
faculty
different, they have developed different capacities, and just an ordinary Muslim believer, right? I don't understand what you don't understand.
No.
They have
the question
different
is like we are
capacities.
talking about like 5 senses you have and I have, and we all have these, right? But we are exercising differently,
Yeah.
right? So that exercising differently is what the intellect is about.
Mhm.
Maybe you have more knowledge about an apple, which I just see and smell, but you have go further beyond it, right?
Mhm.
So that perfection I'm talking about, do that kind of a perfection in the soul have faculty to make a difference between you and him or myself?
Okay, can someone who's on such a high exalted level tell the difference between different people's capacities? Is that
I'm talking about after that, not before.
after death?
Yeah. Is it going to be some faculties that we can see and tell because of these faculties you are different? I can understand somebody's bad and become a bad Jew or something
Yeah,
like that.
presumably. We'll kind of have to wait and find out.
Yeah, that's what.
There's an element of tashakhus going like the
Of individuation.
individuation.
Yeah.
that the Shīʿah is because of what?
Hmm.
That's the question.
The individuation is because of what?
It's because of the faculty that possess,
Mhm.
or because of the intensity of nur, or the darkness, or something like that.
I would say it's because of the intensity of the nur, because of the things that they did.
So then there is no, then there's supposed to be any sort of movement in the soul after they detach from the body. Because once you are spent some time in the darkness, you become the whole, I don't know, true self of nur. Like some said, you cannot like live forever in hell, then there's supposed to be some sort of movement in that soul.
Okay, can there be actualization after somebody
Right.
is dead? Is I think
It
the
seems
question.
to be like, right? Like, are we going to be in hell forever? If
That's
it's
what
not, no, if it's not, then what
I don't
makes
want to
us?
go there right now.
No, I don't want to. But
I don't want to discuss that
I
one.
know, like,
Yeah.
because the thing is, like, we are exercising our five senses.
Yeah,
okay,
so
but-
presumably, not even presumably, now we're getting into the area
Hudud al-Jannah.
well, we're getting,
Yeah, so it's just
no,
about
we're
the-
going into nusus,
the-
just the nas like the Quran would
Yeah.
indicate. And reliable hadiths would indicate that there's plenty of things that accrue to you, a person after they die. So
then
if
there's a
they
movement.
have a righteous, offspring that prays for them, or their relatives pray for them, or they dig a well
So
for them,
then
or
if
they
don't
do
have
some,
five
or they
senses, then-
established a waqf for something or a
No, I
scholarship,
understand, but the question
right?
is.
So they're still getting reward for that. Let's say you establish a sabil, as
So
long,
then it
and
means
you
that there's
die,
supposed to be a potentiality exists when you are detached from the body. Then potentiality comes from where then? Then that mada comes from where? That's the question.
I think we're moving from pure philosophy
now into
into theology and
to pure theology.
No, because that is what we're.
I
talking
cannot
about,
explain it to you, because if we make the argument that when the person dies, they're a pure actuality,
Then that's.
right? So
yeah,
then that would mean that they're done.
done. That's what I'm saying.
But let's say they established some sort of a pious endowment, and that endowment continues, mashallah, till the day of judgment, whenever that is. So they're in their barzakh, in the grave, and people are benefiting from that endowment. So somehow you're, at least not in philosophical language, but in theological language, say that their darajat would continue to increase, that their rank.
I guess one way to go
their
about
rank
it
would
is
be
that in barzakh there is not necessarily a complete disconnect from the body
Yeah, that is, yeah.
and the ruh, in the sense that the body doesn't have those capacities, but it seems that there's some sort of
Might have a different-
locational, spatial, locational connection or whatnot with the grave site of an individual.
Yeah, that's why
It's-
people go to the graves.
Yeah.
That's why the body has to be.
Or in the case of somebody who is a pious individual and their body has not decayed. The
There are
body of the
cases of this
Ma'asumin
as well.
alayhi salam, or the Prophet Muhammad
Yeah.
sallallahu alayhi
Sallallahu
wa
alayhi
sallam,
wasallam.
that shows that even in actuality, after passing away, there is a connection with the body.
Yeah.
So perhaps that could
Maybe.
be without, I haven't thought about this too carefully.
No,
It's
but
just
these are
a,
good lines of question.
hypothesis.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
Yani it is zam. Zam.
Yeah, this gets way beyond the anima,
Yeah.
but that's a whole other area.
Yeah, it's,
Area of ruhaniyat and all
we're
that.
mixing, I
I'm
think,
just
sciences and
curious
disciplines.
about movement, because for movement, we need to have a matter. So if we do not have matter in soul, then how the movement going to occur? That is the question I have. It's not about ruhaniyat in such sense. It's just
This discussion being recorded.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think it's a question of movement. I think it's a question of, if you mean change,
right.
you mean change, because change, I think what you're trying to say is that for change to be possible, there has to remain an unactualized potentiality.
Right.
And so if the person is dead and they've become a pure actuality,
Yeah.
that would mean that, and if things can still develop in a progressive, ameliorative fashion due to a pious foundation or what have you, the various things which are mentioned in the text, then that means that there are still unactualized
Actualized
potentiality.
Potentialities. Yeah.
And that potentially comes from
From where?
Zahiran, I like my hypothesis so far.
But it's not connected with the body because the
No.
body
Yeah,
is in
that's
its
the
grave.
problem.
So it
The
means
body
like
in its grave, and the person has established a sabil, a fountain, or whatever, and it's still going, or they established a university, or they gave $1 million for some.
Well, they used the body at the time to establish it, and the athar and the atharat of that are continuing.
No, that these answers are the Rohani answers, but the
No, these are not.
Like
These
a
are
5 cent-
Mullā answers. Molvi answer.
I try to be as
No proof.
Yeah, I know.
I
Hypothesis.
mean, it sounds good.
I use the word zam.
It sounds good. Yeah, I don't know.
So maybe these 5 senses play more crucial role than the just 5 senses of it.
So maybe it's possible that there is such a thing as a. It sounds so silly to say, but a potential, right? So that the person dies. Yeah, potential. So the person dies, but they never established a pious foundation or whatever. And let's say they didn't have any like amazing deeds whose results are still continuing after they die, but they raised some really good kids, and those kids are praying for them every day, right? And they go on, they do a hajj for them, and then they do stuff on their behalf. So it would seem that if you believe those texts, I believe those texts, I don't know how to explain in the context of
Yeah.
then it would seem that there would be a potential. Yeah, so that agar wo bacche ye sab kar rahe hain unke walidain ke liye masalan, like if those kids are doing this for their departed parents, then this will happen, otherwise it won't.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully I can get the answers after we finish these pictures.
I don't know. We should submit this to some. We should write this up and ask.
Some more honest.
No, you'd have to find somebody who's deeply involved in. I think.
Like it's Hassan Zada.
I don't think he's accepting questions. He's no longer alive.
No,
He
he's,
can't.
he's a student.
But that also raises a lot of questions because people say there's various methods in these Ruhani books, for example, of Kashful Qubur, and you can like go to a grave and you can like recite whatever, and you can talk to the deceased person, or you can do Kashful Arwah, you can be sitting on this side of the world, and if your spirituality is powerful enough, you can recite X, Y, and Z and summon the spirit of, I don't know, Mir Damad and ask him
What is time?
ask him what is time. That's what people say, but is it really possible? I don't deny that it's possible, but it's not very easy to do, at least. Anyway, this is kind of breaking down now. So much for that. So I think next time, a lot to talk about with book 3. And book 3 is also about the same length as this book. It's 13 chapters. It's about 25 pages, so not a lot of reading. So let's just read through that and we'll discuss it next time, inshallah. I'm going to stop the recording now. Yeah.